Hi, I'm Mike Krause, editor-in-chief of CompleteColorado.com, filling in for a vacationing Jon Caldara. And speaking of Jon Caldara, he had a chance recently to sit down in our Studio B with Hannah Cox from an organization called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty to talk about the death penalty. We're going to show you that interview, but don't go anywhere, because right after, we're coming right back here to Devil's Advocate to talk about the legislative session and where the Democrat majority is going to find all the money to pay for their ambitious agenda. Be right back.
So it's not just liberals who don't like the death penalty. Apparently they're conservatives as well. Hannah Cox from Conservatives Against the Death Penalty. You have a much better name for it. So
you were so close.
Yeah, just give me the real name.
Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty.
Oh, so you're not against it, you're just concerned about it.
I'm pretty against it, but
No, you're just concerned about it.
Some people are more concerned. I'd say I'm more just, adamantly opposed, but.
All right, this is a national organization.
It is.
But you're here in Colorado because you want to lobby the legislature to pass a ban on the death penalty. Why? Nobody has been put to death in Colorado in well over a decade, and it's not like our governor is going to have one happen anytime soon, if ever.
Well, I think that's all the more the reason to get rid of it. It's not something that you're actually using, and we know when we look into the data that death penalty cases cost about $1 million more than life in prison without parole cases on average, and it's not because it takes too long. 70% of those costs are coming from the trial alone. So that means if you're a state that has a death penalty system and you're not carrying out executions, you're still spending a lot of money to bring death penalty cases all for nothing. That's something that doesn't give victims finality. It doesn't actually spend money on programs that could work to deter crime, which we know the death penalty does not. And that's money you're not spending on solving more crimes, which we actually still do very little of in this country. We only have about a 51% average homicide clearance rate, much lower for other violent rates of crime. So I'd say we should spend that money on actually solving crime.
That's nice. Let's bring it to somebody like me. I've always supported the death penalty because I feel like it's the penalty to fit the crime. However, there's this other part of me that says, wait a second, there's a logical argument to be made here, and I ought to spend some time to think about it. Saving $1 million at that wasteful building, putting somebody to death who should be put to death on trial costs, is not going to motivate me. Why isn't it the right punishment to fit the crime? Or to be more direct, you're a conservative against the death penalty. How is this conservative? Unless this is part of your religious upbringing that nobody should be put to death, but politically, why should a conservative be against the death penalty?
Well, look, I think there's a couple of really solid reasons a conservative should be against the death penalty. First and foremost, we've had one person exonerated from death row in this country for every 10 executions. At that rate, we know we are killing innocent people. We know that more innocent people will be falsely convicted.
Give me that statistic one more time.
One person exonerated from death row for every 10 executions, and that continues to grow.
Now, does exonerated mean innocent, or does that mean cloudy?
So exonerated means most likely innocent. I can't say it means innocent because that's actually not a classification that our judicial system has at its disposal. You're not found innocent.
Are you suggesting that 10% of people put to death shouldn't be put to death?
I'm saying statistically we know one person for every 10 executions has had enough evidence to come before a jury or a judge and prove that there is enough evidence that they almost certainly did not commit these crimes. Sometimes it's proved conclusively by DNA evidence. Other times it's a burden of evidence. But we know that we're getting it wrong all of the time. As a pro-life person, that's simply unacceptable to me. And as someone who believes in a limited government, I believe in a limited government because I know government is fallible, because I know it's wasteful, because I know it's prone to corruption. And the death penalty system is certainly no exception from that. And so I think for people who have the same principles as me of fiscal conservatism, limited government, valuing the sanctity of human life, there's plenty of reasons.
There are always religious conservatives who don't like the death penalty.
Sure.
And that's purely on ideological grounds. Talk to me from the libertarian point of view. You've given me one point, which is you say 10% of those who appealed have been exonerated. So the false positive problem. Mm-hmm. All right. Will you admit that there's a deterrent effect that happens? So yes.
No, I would fight you
Really?
harshly on that, yes.
Tell me about that.
So we know, I mean, there is conclusive data that shows the death penalty is certainly not a deterrent. And in fact, the data suggests that it actually correlates with higher rates of violent crime. So when we see a state or even a region get rid of the death penalty or not have it, we either see rates of violent crime maintain the same level or they even drop. We never see a spike. Meanwhile, in states that actively use it the most, they always correlate with rates of higher violent crime. I would suggest that's because of the amount of money you're wasting on death penalty cases that you're not spending on actually being tough on crime, on actually solving more crimes, or on actually putting money into programs that could work to deter violence.
What about in a place like Colorado where the death penalty is all but gone? You know, the four people on death row are not going to see the death penalty. I just don't see it ever happening. If we have a mass murderer like the shooter in the Aurora theater shooting, if he doesn't get the death penalty, nobody's going to get the death penalty. So our crime rate is increasing in Colorado, and for all practical purposes, we don't have the death penalty.
But you do still have it, and so you're not looking at the sunken cost here, right? This is sort of like the broken window fallacy. You have a lot of money that's still being spent on this system. Even if you're not carrying out executions, you are still bringing capital cases, which again is where most of the costs are coming from in the system. Also on top of that, the amount of certification that requires for your public defenders, for your prosecutors.
What do you mean certification?
Everybody involved has to maintain death penalty certification eligibility. So that is a huge resource time zap on these offices where they have to take
As a
on.
libertarian, you shouldn't want that kind of certification to begin with. Why don't you get rid of that?
Well, it's not a licensing issue. It's something that actually says that you understand how to be an attorney in a capital case because they are so much more complex. They have to make sure that people who are representing people have the qualifications to adequately give them
Sounds like a
representation.
licensing scheme.
Well, it might be, but at the rate that people still struggle to get good representation when they're facing death row, I don't know. So at the end of the day, whether or not that should go away is probably a conversation for another time. But what we do know is that's a huge time burden on these offices. And so again, that's time that they're not spending on solving more cases. That's time they're not spending on programs that actually work. We know the death penalty doesn't. So even though you're not carrying out executions, this is a really big burden on your state that you're still carrying. And for what? If you're not going to carry out executions, what's the point in having it? I think it doesn't really make any sense at all.
It is an option, and answer the objection I find myself struggling with, which is it's the penalty to fit the crime. I remember Ken Klober, former state senator, whose mother was brutally killed, and he finally went to the killer's execution. I remember talking to him. Matter of fact, on this show, I talked to him about what it was like to witness the execution, and did it bring closure. It was amazing how strongly he felt that it was the right thing to do as the victim, as the son of the victim, and there would be no convincing him that his mother's death would have been justified or there'd be closure without that. This was what he worked for.
And I never attempt to speak for all victims. There's a lot of nuance to how victims' family members feel, but I will say for every victim that feels as he does, there's another victim on the other side that feels the exact opposite. And so I tend to sort of stay away from that argument because I don't think it's right for me to speak to their feelings, but I do think it's important that we recognize there's a wide expanse of how victims' family members feel about this as a subject. I also kind of have to push back when you say that this is something that is merited, because for who? And that's what you need to dig into when you come to the death penalty, because it's merited for a select few. If you look into who gets the death penalty and why, it has very little to do with the actual heinousness of the crime. And I think that's pretty obvious in Colorado even, where you have your most notorious killer who did not get the death penalty most recently here. If you look into who gets it and why, the leading determinant is actually the county where the crime was committed. We see that 2% of the nation's counties bring the majority of death penalty cases. And to date, since reinstatement in the late 1970s, every single execution in this country has come from less than 16% of our counties. So it's very, very much based on where the crime is committed.
Which two counties? You said a majority come
2%.
from 2% come from
The majority of death penalty cases come from only 2% of our nation's counties. And then across the board, all executions have come from less than 16% of the nation's counties. So it's very much driven.
Are those high crime areas?
They're very random.
I would have to look at that and go, wait a second, I bet the crime in those areas are very different as well.
Not always.
It's not like rural counties have that many big crimes.
oftentimes they do have big crimes, but they don't have the budgets to bring the cases. So if you have a richer area and you have a DA who's usually higher profile, you'll see them bring more cases typically. The second leading factor on who gets it is, can they afford good representation? Someone who can afford good representation almost never ends up on death row. And so we see a system that has a lot of socioeconomic bias by nature of who gets it and also by nature of who we prosecute it for. So if you kill a white woman in this country, you are significantly more likely to be given capital charges than you are if you kill a black person or a man or Hispanic person. The fact is, we value victims really differently. And for some people, when they're killed, we say, not only are we going to spend resources to find your killer.
But you're not advocating for treating the killers of different victims the same.
I am. I'm saying that
you're,
I think
you're not saying let's put more killers of black people on death row.
No, because there's all these other problems with the system. So of course I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that I think many people have this perception that people who are on death row committed much more heinous crimes and are the quote, quote, worst of the worst. And nothing could be further from the truth. If you start digging into these cases, oftentimes you'll find something where like a drug deal went bad or something where it was a crime of passion. And not to say that I don't want to rank victims differently. I think all homicides are equally awful. But by nature of how our system operates, we say to the general public that they're not. We say that some victims are worth spending in excess $1 million for a capital case. And some victims, we don't even find your killer. In fact, 49% of victims, we don't even find your killer. There's something very, very disgusting about that to me.
Let's talk about the politics in Colorado. Without a couple of Democrats, this thing is stalled in the Senate. Most notably, Rhonda Fields, whose son was killed, is a proponent of the death penalty. And when Democrats, with their arrogance last session, rolled right over her without including her in this, she's a pretty strong lady, and that she stood up and she said, and she killed the whole thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know what changes this year. My sense is there's a lot of personal loyalty amongst some of the Democrats there. So you're going to need to get Republicans on board, and enough of them to counter Senator Rhonda Fields and her friends. Do you have it?
You know, I think that we are on our way to having it, and I also have to say I really hate how things went down last year with Senator Fields. I wasn't here or a part of it, but I have heard, and my heart goes out to her as it does to all victims, and I certainly want them included in the conversation and really value their experience. I hope that there's been work done to repair the damage that happened there, but I can only speak to my organization, which predominantly works with Republicans, and I know that we've been doing a lot to educate Republicans, to speak to lawmakers on the right, and to try to make sure they're aware of all the reasons that the system really doesn't line up with conservative values.
All right, so given the minority of Republicans, how you doing?
So far, so good. This is my first full day in the state, so still a lot of ground to cover, quite literally. But I'll be here for the next couple of days, and I'll be back a good bit this year, so I'm not complaining.
How many Republicans are on board? Do you have a number?
I don't have my vote count right in front of me, but we've got several, so I think we...
Several?
Yes.
So, any names?
I'll let them make their statements on their own, but
Okay.
I think you'll be hearing from them soon.
If this passes, I assume the governor signs it pretty quickly.
I think so. He's given an indication that he is open to repealing the death penalty.
How many states still have the death penalty?
So this is an interesting question. Only 25 states still have the death penalty at all.
I like the adjective only. Yeah. You mean
that's
half?
That's half.
Not only, that's half.
And a lot of them have repealed their systems in the past 2 decades. So we've seen a tremendous amount of gains in this area in recent years. Of the 25 that still have it, over a third of them have not used it in a decade or more. And then last year was the 5th in a row that we saw the country carry out fewer than 30 executions. All of those
nationwide.
Nationwide. All of those have been coming from only about 8 states and usually more than half out of Texas alone. So it is significantly on the downward trend.
Obviously, Texas is number one. Who's?
Florida would be right behind them. Tennessee came out of
retirement. So you're talking about 2 very Republican states.
Yeah, very Republican states, but we've also seen a lot of Republican gains. Last year we had 11 states with Republican-sponsored pieces of legislation to repeal alone. One of those passed and even passed a governor's veto in New Hampshire with significant bipartisan support. And then your neighbor, Wyoming, actually passed it through their House, no problem, and fell only about 4 votes shy in the Senate, so they'll be back this year as well. But I think they certainly will repeal it in the next year or 2. And then Utah is chomping at the bit. So we've got a couple really red states that I think are in the pipeline, and I guess the race is on to see who gets it first in the West.
People want to get some information about what you do in and how you're doing it, where do they go?
Yeah, conservativesconcerned.org. We're asking
Conservatives concerned.
Concerned. Yep. .org.
See, this-
See, look, you don't have
Concerned.
to. But this is
We're all
important.
concerned. How about conservatives against the death penalty?
No, because here's the thing that's important, and I'm not one of them. I'm unilaterally opposed to it now. But we do have some people, I think, who would say that were they able to get to a point that they thought the government could adequately carry out the system without failure, that they might support it. So maybe people would say, in theory, I don't, have a problem with the system, but in practice, I do. And so I think the concern is important because we could sit here and have a debate all day about whether or not, in theory, the death penalty is appropriate. I don't really care. I know it's not appropriate how it's working in practice, and so it's time to get rid of it. So I'll work with anybody that joins me in that.
So conservatives concerned.
.org.
.org. Hannah, thank you.
Thank you.